everyone, today I have a tutorial for you on one of my very early self-drafted patterns. I like to call this pattern the paper pouch. It is based off the measurements of an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, but for the update I am including pattern pieces for you. You can find the link to download the free PDF template in the video description. The paper pouch pattern was one of my very first videos. They're still up on the channel, but I wanted to redo those videos to be more in line with my more recent videos. This pattern requires 2 exterior pieces, 2 lining pieces, and a zipper. You will also have a piece of fusible stabilizer that measures 7 inches tall by 10 inches wide with 2-inch cutouts on either side that you will fuse centered to the back of your exterior piece. I am going to be doing a 2-tab zipper installation for my pouch today, but you can use an open-ended zipper, wide opening zipper, or you can use the Butler method to install your zipper. I have my 2 exteriors that have been interfaced with lightweight woven interfacing. They also have the stabilizer piece applied to the back, fused centered on my exterior panel. I have my 2 lining pieces. Note that the corner of my lining piece is squared up at the outside edge, which means that this inside corner here is not a right angle. That is something that is different from the original paper pouch pattern that I released a couple of years ago. You will also need a zipper and 1 zipper pull that measures 9.5 inches and 2 tab pieces for the ends of your zipper that measure approximately 2 by 2 inches. I like to use the cutouts from my exterior. So let's get going. The first thing that we need to do is install our zipper. We're going to be using a 2-tab zipper, so we have to make sure that it is the correct length before we sew it in place. In order to get the correct length for our zipper, we need to measure the upper edge of our pattern piece. For mine, this is 11 inches wide. We're using a measurement that is 1.5 inches narrower than the width of our upper edge so that we have space to sew our side seam on our finished pouch. If you use a zipper that is too much longer than that, it will be hard to sew your side seams when you are going past the zipper tabs. If you're using zipper by the yard, make sure that your pull is on and keep both ends of your zipper closed. If you're using a dress zipper or a handbag zipper that has stops at either end, you want to make sure that the distance between your stops is long enough for the section that you are using. The area on either end doesn't count in that zipper measurement. If you're using a dress zipper or a handbag zipper, baste the open end of your zipper so that it stays well aligned, which will make it easier to install our tab. Measure your zipper so that it is 1.5 inches shorter than the width of your exterior pattern piece. Mine is 11 inches, so I want the coils of my zipper tape to measure 9.5 inches. Making sure that my pull is on, I'm going to cut that down to size and then cinch the ends of my zipper tape. With your zipper cut to size, what we need to do is place our tabs. Fold your zipper tab wrong sides together and make a crease. Then fold these outside edges in to meet that fold to create a double fold tab. You will do the same for both of your tab pieces. I like to use a piece that is 2 inches this way. It doesn't need to be 2 inches tall. My zipper tape is 1 1/4 inch, so it can be narrower than that. If your tab is not 2 inches wide, then your finished folded over tab piece will be slightly narrower. If you have a small bag opening, that may be something that you want to change. Do the same for the second tab. And what we're now going to do is wrap the tabs around each of the ends of our zipper. So I've tucked the closed zipper end inside of that tab, lining it up with the fold it over the end, and then I'm going to clip that in place. And then before I sew those tabs on, I'm just going to double check that there is enough space on either side of my zipper for the eventual side seams of my pouch. And that looks good. And now I am going to sew the tab in place. I'm going to start my stitches in the side seam here, pivot and sew along the front, and pivot again when I get to this other limit of my zipper tape. Do the same on both sides, making sure that I am catching both sides of my folded over tab. I'm using a nylon zipper so I can sew straight over the teeth, but I will have my hump jumper nearby in case I struggle to get over that bulk. I'm using a longer stitch length and using a seam allowance of 1/8 of an inch. Check that you have caught the tab on both sides, and then you can take it back over to your table to trim the edges and trim your threads. When you're trimming the edges of those tabs and trimming your threads, make sure that you are not accidentally snipping your zipper tape. Slide your zipper pull all the way to one side, and then fold your zipper tape in half, matching up the folded edges of those tabs, and mark the center. I like to put a small snip just at the very edge of my zipper tape to mark the center point, but you can choose to use a pen if that is your preference. Then mark the center of your pattern pieces. When we install this zipper, it will be sitting at the top of our finished bag with the two exteriors, and then the two linings will be on the inside underneath, and we will be creating a zipper sandwich for both sides of the zipper. I like to use double-sided tape for when I am installing my zippers, but if you prefer, you can use clips or pins. I'm going to place double-sided tape all the way from one edge to the other on my exterior and lining pieces. I find that by using a 1/8 of an inch double-sided tape, I can get a nice, straight, smooth zipper, and the tape is narrow enough that it doesn't get in my stitch line. Working first with one exterior piece, remove the backing from your double-sided tape, and then lay your zipper down, noting which end your pull is facing towards. I want this to be the front of my pouch, so I'm going to have my pull facing to the left. You can choose if you want your pull to open from the left to the right or the right to the left. And line up the center mark of your zipper tape with your zipper coil face down on the exterior print side of your pouch. And you're going to press that in place from the center out to the edge. You want to make sure that it is nice and smooth, that there are no waves, and that your zipper tape is as close to the edge of your exterior fabric as you can get it. You can move the zipper pull as you go to make sure that it is nice and smooth and that there's not a bubble where that pull is. If you are using clips rather than using double-sided tape, you're still going to match up the center, and then you're going to work your way out and secure your zipper tape all the way along. An optional step here is to baste the zipper to the exterior before you create your zipper sandwich. Because I'm using double-sided tape, I don't find that step to be necessary. If you are using clips or pins, adding a row of basting stitches at 1/8 of an inch just along the width of your exterior where your zipper tape is can help reduce any shifting when you sew the lining to your exterior. So if you aren't using double-sided tape, I recommend sewing a line of stitches just along this upper edge at 1/8 of an inch. You do not need to back stitch when you are sewing this line of basting stitches. Moving your zipper pull out of the way can help to make sure that you get a nice straight stitch line. The straighter your zipper is before you sew it in place, the straighter the zipper will be on your finished bag. Take your lining piece. If you're using double-sided tape, remove the backing and then match up the center. So you have the three centers lined up. Your exterior is right sides together with your zipper coils, and your lining is face down on the back of your zipper tape, right sides together with your exterior. Press it down from the center out to the edges, and the outside edge should line up. If you're using clips, start in the center again Smooth it along so that your zipper tape is sandwiched between the exterior and your lining. You have exterior, you're looking at the back of your zipper tape, your coils are face down on your exterior, and this is the correct side of your lining, face down with the correct side of your exterior. And now we're going to sew along the upper edge. Back stitching at the beginning and at the end. We're going to sew all the way from one end to the other end of the zipper. We're going to slide our zipper pull out of the way as we need to make sure that we're getting a nice straight line of stitches. I like to use a seam allowance of 5/16 of an inch when I install a zipper, but if you have a narrower zipper tape, like a size 3 zipper tape, then a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance may be more appropriate. I've switched over to a zipper foot, and I like to sew with my coils facing up, which has my lining down on the feed dogs. That helps it to feed through more evenly, and I also find that my project sits more flat when the coils are facing up. Here, where my zipper pull is, you can see that the tape is pulling away a little. I'm going to be sliding my pull as I go to make sure that I have a nice straight line all the way along and that none of my layers are shifting out of position. Using a shorter stitch length and my zipper foot, because I've used double-sided tape, I don't have my clips on, but if you have used clips, they would still be in place right now. Back stitching, sewing straight from one edge to the other. Where my tab is, making sure I'm not missing any stitches, and sewing all the way along. My pull is here. I'm going to slide it back where I've already sewn, coming off the tab on the other side. You can use a stiletto to make sure that the material is hugging around the tab so that you don't get any gaps in your top seam, and back stitch when you get to the other end. Fold the exterior open and smooth it away from the zipper teeth. If your material can be ironed on, you can press that crease or use a seam roller. And I'm also going to press it away on the back. Before we top stitch the first side, I'm going to attach the second side of the zipper to the rest of my pouch. So repeating the same steps, lining up the center of the exterior with the center of the zipper tape, making sure that the raw edge of your exterior is flush with the edge of your zipper tape. You can also check that the edge of your exteriors are lined up at the side, moving the zipper pull if you need to. Check that you have equal spacing at either end. You want to have a gap of about 3/4 of an inch. Then you can baste this first side of the zipper to your exterior, or you can go ahead and sandwich that now if you're using double-sided tape. Lay the second lining piece, right sides down on the back of your zipper, right sides together with your first lining piece. Press it along. I find starting in the center and working my way out gives me the best results. Press it around the tab, and then we're going to sew along this other edge using the same seam allowance as you did for the first side. So whatever seam allowance you used for the first side of your zipper, you want to match that on the other side so that you get even spacing on either side of your coils. Sewing at 5/16 of an inch. Back to your shortest stitch length if you have changed it for basting. Careful at the tabs that you don't skip any stitches. Slide your pull out of the way. And back stitching at the other end. Press your exterior and your lining away from the zipper on the second side and check that the spacing on either side of your zipper coils is the same for the front and the back. When you're happy that you have a straight zipper installation with equal spacing, you can top stitch that zipper. When you're top stitching, you can choose to top stitch just where the zipper is itself, sewing through the exterior and your lining, or you can sew through just the exterior and the seam allowance of that zipper tape. If you sew your exterior and your lining together all the way along, you are going to get pinched in corners. And I will link the video that I have that goes into more detail on that. For today, I am going to sew just my exterior and not my lining. So I'm going to flip my lining out of the way. So both lining panels and one exterior are on one side, and I have a single exterior panel on the other side. And I'm going to sew from one end to the other through my exterior and my seam allowance. I'm going to start my back stitching in my side seam the same way as we did for the zipper tab, pivot and come down this end, pivot again and back stitch, making sure that my pull is not getting in the way as I'm sewing. When I've done the first side, I'm going to flip my linings to the other side, and then I will sew the same way, back stitching, pivoting to sew down here and pivot again, sewing through the second exterior side and that seam allowance, again not sewing through my lining at all when I'm top stitching next to my zipper. Using a longer stitch length and a seam allowance of 1/8 of an inch. Check that my lining is smoothed out of the way and sew straight down this edge. Slide the pull out of the way. Pivot and back stitch. Move my 2 linings to the other side and then repeat that top stitching on the other side of that zipper. Trim your threads, and now we can finish sewing up our paper pouch. Making sure that your zipper is open at least part of the way, we're going to fold our bag so that the right sides are together for the exterior and the lining. And you want to match up where the lining and the exterior meet. I like to place a staple at the fold, and I am putting my staple within the seam allowance and on the exterior. So it's going to staple just over that seam allowance. You want to make sure that your bag is flat when you're doing so. Press the teeth of that staple down so that it doesn't catch on your machine when you're sewing, and do the same on the other side. And that is going to help us get nicely lined up corners on our bag. Placing clips to get your position right can be helpful too. When you're happy with how well lined up that is, place clips the rest of the way around your bag. I'm going to be sewing around my exterior and my lining in one go. Because the lining pattern piece is drafted to be smaller than the exterior, we will use the same seam allowance the whole way around. I'm going to be sewing with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to start at the turning hole in the lining, sew up to the first box corner, and then continue along doing the lining and exterior side seam, sewing along the exterior bottom, and then sewing the remaining 2 side seams. When I've sewn those, I will box my corners. Placing clips around the entire outside. The edges of your box corners should be as well lined up as you can get them. I like to leave a turning hole of about 3.5 to 4 inches, depending on the thickness of my materials. You can mark that if you like, or you can just eyeball it as you go. And when I sew at my turning hole, I am going to start perpendicular to my bottom lining seam. I'm going to sew in 3/8 of an inch and back stitch, and then I will pivot to sew the closed part of my lining before continuing around the rest of the way. When I come back up, I will sew along here at 3/8 of an inch to the other edge of my turning hole, pivot again, and sew towards that lower edge and back stitch. And that will help the lining of my bag to close up nicely after we've turned it out. There should be enough space at the end of your zipper tab for you to be able to sew past. The 3/4 of an inch gap should be enough, but you may find that switching to a narrower zipper foot is necessary to get past here without too much trouble. That's something to keep in mind if your space there is a little narrower. Using a shorter stitch length and a seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch, back stitching here perpendicular to the seam, and then pivoting, sewing up to the first boxed corner, I like to back stitch at each boxed corner. If you like, you can pull your boxed corner tight here and continue straight along. I still like to back stitch when I do that, and I don't like to do it for my exteriors because I find that my box corner is harder to line up when it is joined at the ends of the seam. Coming up to the join between the exterior and the lining, taking care of the bulk. If you are using thicker materials, then you can use a hump jumper to get up over there, and also being careful of that staple. Now sewing down the straight side of the exterior, back stitching at the exterior corner, sewing along the exterior bottom seam, coming up to the other end of my zipper, being careful of the staple and the bulk of that tab. I like to add a couple of reinforcing back stitches just in the area where the overlap is of that seam allowance, as that is a high stress area. And because my tab is here, I can just see that my presser foot is going to come down over that bulk a little, and it may skip a stitch. So I'm going to pop my hump jumper underneath for support to try to keep a nice straight seam there. Continue to the last boxed corner. Back stitching again. And then, as I did for the first side, if you like, you can tuck this seam straight up there. I like to back stitch, come along, and I'm going to pivot and back stitch perpendicular to the seam. And then if you take a look at these lining corners, the reason that some people like to jump across that corner there is so that it will help them line up that bottom seam. I personally find it trickier to do it this way, but if you want to, you can leave the threads attached, and then you can line up your center bottom and your side seam so that you can box your corners. Just push your seams toward each other, and I have mine folding to opposite directions because of the way that I have done the turning hole. But if you like, you can butterfly that open. So rather than push it to one side and the other, you would fold it open like this. Make sure that your seams are matched up, and then you can box your corner. I find that to be just a little trickier than my usual way of doing it. So that is why I don't like to do it particularly on the exterior. I'm going to position my box corners the way that I usually like to do it. Fold open the bottom seam, and you can push your seams to opposite sides, or you can butterfly them open. And whichever way you do it, you want to make sure that you are lining up the center bottom seam with your center side seam as best you can. You can use clips or you can use staples to get that into position. I first like to line up the center, and then I place a clip at the side to keep everything nicely lined up. And you should have a flat line here at your boxed corner. You can use double-sided tape to smooth that seam allowance to either side if you like, or you can press it. Line up the seams again. I like to make sure that they are lined up at the line that my seam allowance will be. If they're lined up at the very edge, but then they are skew width a little further down, then you're not going to get neatly matched up corners. They need to be lined up all the way down. because you're going to be sewing it at 3/8 of an inch. So make sure that's lined up and nice and square, at least 1/2 inch beyond the edge of your material. So my exteriors are lined up. Now for my lining boxed corners. I'm going to do it the same way. However, on the lining, I'm going to push my seam allowance to opposite sides because of the way that the opening in the lining is done. So you want to have your seam allowance to the left on one side and the right on the other, and then I just butt the fold up against each other, again making sure that it is lined up where the stitch line will be, not just at that edge. And this too should be nice and flat if you've used the pattern template. If you have just cut out a straight boxed corner from a tapered side, then it will have the angle at the side there. Because it's a lining, it's not sitting on that seam anyway, so it doesn't really matter like it does for the exterior, but I do have the pattern pieces that are drafted so that it will sit as a straight line if you prefer to do it that way. Make sure that your seam here is folding the same way so that it doesn't twist. And then I'm going to sew all 4 corners using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Because the boxed corner here is smaller than the boxed corner here, this corner will still nest inside of my exterior even though I'm using the same seam allowance. If you cut out the same size box, a 2-inch lining with a 2-inch exterior, and use the same seam allowance, your boxes are going to be the same size, so they're not going to nest very well. In that instance, you would use a slightly smaller seam allowance so that your box is smaller than your exterior. So rather than 3/8 of an inch, you might use 1/4 of an inch. Keeping everything lined up, back stitching at the beginning, sew straight down. And then sewing the exterior. Trim all of your threads and remove any staples that you've put in your seam allowance. If you've used a thicker material, you may want to trim back the seam allowance where the exterior and the lining meet. I generally prefer not to do that, but what I do is just fold that seam allowance open, which can help me get a nicely nested corner on my finished pouch. But if you've used vinyl, then you may want to trim that back to reduce that bulk. Turn your bag out through the hole in your lining. If you've used thicker materials, then using a hairdryer can help to make the material more supple if it's vinyl or waterproof canvas, for example. For mine, I'm just going to squish it through. Leaving a larger turning hole is a good idea if you've used thicker materials. Poke out the corners of your exterior at the bottom, and then go to the end of your zipper, and where the tab is, I like to fold the seam open, and then I'm just going to put my finger or my thumb on the join between the exterior and the lining, or slightly below, and then just push that corner out. And if you push up on that seam, you can help it to come out nicely at the end there. You're going to do that on both sides of your zipper, or if you've done a single tab, you're going to do it at the tab end. You can still fold that seam allowance open if you have done an open-ended zipper. And that little bit of space there is normal. If you have it too tight, then you're not going to get a nice corner. With practice, you can slightly reduce the size of that gap there by using 5/8 of an inch rather than 3/4 of an inch. But if you're using thicker material, then you may struggle to get that corner to sit out nicely. There are other zipper options that don't have gaps, if that is something that you don't like. When you've got your bag turned out and you are happy with the shape of your corners, you can close up your lining. If you like, you can pin the lining corner to the exterior corner. And what I mean by that is take your lining corner and the exterior corner on the same side. Make sure that the side seams are sitting on top of each other, and then you are going to baste them just at about 1/8 of an inch within the seam allowance. And that will hold your lining down inside of your bag. It does make it slightly more difficult to close up the lining of your bag, but it does stop that lining from pulling out. I have not top stitched my lining, but because the lining has been drafted to fit nice and snugly inside of the exterior, I'm not too concerned about it coming up. If that is something that you are worried about, then pinning that lining to the exterior will stop that from happening. Once you're happy with your shape, pull up your lining. And if you pull on the edges of that opening, because of the way that we have sewn that perpendicular line, the edges of your lining should sit nicely opposed. I like to press those folds with my seam roller. And then you can sew that closed using your sewing machine, or you can use a ladder stitch to hand sew it closed. And once it's closed up, tuck it back inside of your bag. If you have used heat tolerant material, then you can press the outside of that to reduce any creases. And your paper pouch is all finished. I'm going to give mine a bit of a press. You can adjust this if you find that the 2-inch depth is too wide for you. You will want to make sure that you are using the corresponding depth for your lining box corners that is 1/4 of an inch smaller than your exterior boxed corners. And you can substitute heavier fleece or foam or Decaville if you want a firmer finished pouch. And I'll have a link to the pattern template in the video description. Hope that helps. Thanks everyone.